It's so simple. We get so caught up that we got to do research. We got to go and get more data. We got to see the transactional data. In actual fact, it's just actually sitting with your customers, bringing a couple in and talking to them and finding out how they're using your products. I used to work in an advertising agency, and what I loved to do every time I had a new client was the first thing I did was I would sit. So I had a car manufacturer as a client. I would sit in one of the showrooms and watch how the interaction, how does the customer look at the vehicles? How do they interact with the salespeople? All of this is telling you something. So it's that just pull yourself back and look at the experience.
This is the Entrepreneurs United podcast with your hosts, John St. Pierre and Rich Hoffman.
We're here today with Kim Rozdeba, who is the author of a book, Branding Queen. Kim, talk to us right off the bat. Why did you choose to call it Branding Queen? Why wasn't it Branding Kings or Branding Jokers? Why Branding Queen?
It's about 20 entrepreneurial women. And so that's why it's Queens. But what I discovered as I was going through the research of finding these women, and it goes back 200 years, they were all somewhere along the way, some press, someone called them the queen of something. So it fell into place. I had a number of different other titles, but that was the one that actually, it just fit.
So I think I want to know, Kim, why did you write this book? What was the why behind, I'm going to write a book about these 20 women that go back 200 years, bring me back to the why?
So I write a blog on branding, and it actually started as a possible blog article. I had discovered the champagne Veuve Clicquot. Now, I do not speak French. I live in a country that's bilingual, which is French I should know. But I didn't realize Veuve was widow. So when I discovered that, and I go, why would you put widow on a bottle of very expensive champagne? So I started my quest with that, and I discovered there was a woman that actually was behind the brand. I didn't know that either. So I started to learn more and go, why did she do this? It was going back into Napoleon days. 1810 was when she actually bottled her first champagne. And I thought, okay, maybe there was some sort of legal requirement. Back then, women were second citizens. They had no rights. So you have to read the book to find out why. That was the start. And then I thought, okay, are there other brands out there that I'm not aware of? Because there's some that are quite obvious. In a lot of cases, the brand is named after the woman. But there were others that I discovered. Bissell, the vacuum cleaner. Didn't know. Started off with her husband. Her husband passed away. And in a lot of these cases, that's, again, going back in time, started with her husband, passed suddenly, and they didn't have to continue. They could have sold the business. They could have gone into other. The problem with Bissell was all her kids were too young, and she only had a couple of sons. She had 6 kids, and she took this business and made it an international business. So I had to look for people that really did have skin in the game and that they actually did evolve the business beyond what it was if they had started with a husband or with a partner. In a lot of cases, they started with nobody. But anyways, I started this and I discovered that there's more than one, more than two. Then I thought, okay, this is a 3-part, 4-part. And I just kept finding. I found 20. The youngest brand is about 20 years. In this, again, I wanted to make sure the brand existed sufficiently, that it was successful. It wasn't just a trend out there. And then I got carried away and I got to 40,000 words. And then I thought, how long is a book? So I had to go Google that, and 50 to 100 for nonfiction. So it ended up at 66,000.
Mm-hmm. And your book was published April 4th of 22. Tell me, when did you start the research on this? What year was that?
3 years before.
Okay, so that would have been 2019. So yeah. This also became a COVID project for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I do a lot of traveling normally, and COVID shut that down for 2 years. and it gave me a lot more time to actually write the book. Otherwise, it probably still would be a work in progress.
Yeah. Over the course of doing your research of 20 different women who had businesses for a minimum of 20 years, what was the time where you were stricken the most emotionally? That there was something that triggered you, that created emotion in you? Can you describe what that was and why that created some emotion in you?
Yeah, good, great question. It actually started with Clicquot. When you look back at history and no rights, she was a middle class, upper gentry. Her husband family was quite wealthy. She didn't have to continue this business, but she did. And she did because she wanted to. She was passionate about Pinot Noir. There's some, I think, from a historical perspective, it's actually really hard to find a lot of information on women. Wasn't a topic people wrote about. It was always men out there that were succeeding and making the decisions. It was hard to piece some of the pieces together. But Napoleon, as I said, he was warring with everybody out there. She had a young child, but she persevered and she was gutsy. She did some stuff as well as invented the Riddler. I don't know if you know anything about champagne, but when you make champagne, and you have to put yeast in the second time to get the bubbles. And there's sediment that's in these as well. And she took a table from her kitchen, I think in her kitchen or dining room, and then put holes so that the bottle could go upside down. Now, previous to this, if you had to settled in the bottom of the bottle, then you'd have to pour out all of the wine because you wanted it clear. You don't want this sediment in there. Historically, that's how they had to take it, and then they had to rebottle it. If you put it into the neck, all you do is take the cork out, it shoots out because there's pressure because of the bubbles. All that comes out, and then you just fill a little bit more on top, and then you cork it. Finished, done. So she had invented this. She had her people not tell anybody else. So she had a market advantage for many years from her competitors. So she could be doing this much faster, anyways, I'm just in awe of this woman, of not only being able to be innovative, but also a business person. Her correspondence, I looked at, she wrote, would be every day, I don't know how many letters. And she was writing letters to customers and to clients because, of course, the people that were interested in her product were rich. There were noble people across the world, and she wanted to build this brand as a global brand. So she built this network out there. And if she was today, she would be an influencer for sure out there on TikTok because she was
Kim Kardashian of her time, right?
Yes, exactly. Anyways, you can tell I'm passionate on this one particular person that I never knew. And I tell this story to other people and they go, wow, I didn't know that either. And it says it right on the bottle. It's coming from a woman.
And I know you wrote the book Branding Queen. You did not write the book Branding Kings. But I am interested in knowing any juxtaposition that maybe you found, anything unique to the Branding Queen that maybe was not there with men who were involved in branding.
So I use the phrase, we will build it and they will come. And I use that phrase from a male perspective because we have a great idea and we'll figure out how we're going to market it. I saw in many of the cases of these women, they started with a problem that they wanted to solve. And it was a problem that they themselves had. So they understood their target audience. That was the first thing. And they empathized with their target audience because they did understand their target audience. And they were continually wanting to make their product better and make it so that it was solving a problem for their customers. So that was the first thing I did notice. Whereas when you look through history of building brands, there's a disconnect sometimes. I've loved Uber as a great example, where Uber was started with, it was high-end vehicles like limos, service for business. That's how they started. And then they saw, and they even had, I think, Cab. They had Uber Cab. I think that was the first brand that they came out with. And then Cab, of course, they were to Cab. And if they were treading on cabs into the registration and all of that, they were getting in trouble. So they had to take that off quickly. But they evolved to rideshare and pretty much like a cab with the technology. But a lot of brands start with not really understanding who their target audience is.
So, Kim, let me take that where you just left it. Entrepreneurs are listening to this.
Yeah.
And some of them have built it and hoping people are going to come and then wondering why they're not generating enough revenue or why aren't people as loyal to their brand as they should be. Some people are solving problems, but they're solving problems and no one actually knows that they've solved the problem. So you hit on something there we hear a lot about, like know who your audience is, know what problem you're trying to solve. Are there some keys that entrepreneurs should be thinking about? Is there you got to make sure this criteria in order to ensure that you know who you're going after and they know about you?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to these women because one of the other I thought was a strong attribute amongst all of them is that they listen to their customers. And what I mean by listen to their customers, they interacted with their customers. Estee Lauder, the fragrance cosmetic, she was always on the floor talking to customers. She came up with the concept of samples. You go into any department store today, and there's always samples being handed out. She started that. She used to go around and spray the store with her fragrance so that would attract attention. Oprah Winfrey, okay, she's a brand that I've got in there as well. After every show, she sat with the audience and talked to them. These were their focus groups. Liz Claiborne, she revolutionized the way women buy clothes by putting outfits together. So pants, skirts, all together, color coordinated, so you could mix and match. And it was for the businesswoman. And she would go into stores and she would watch how the customers were interacting. They thought she was a salesperson. So, it's so simple. We get so caught up that we got to do research. We got to go and get more data. We got to see the transactional data. In actual fact, it's just actually sitting with your customers, bringing a couple in and talking to them and finding out how they're using your products. I used to work in an advertising agency. And what I loved to do every time I had a new client was the first thing I did was I would sit. So I had a car manufacturer as a client. I would sit in one of the showrooms and watch how the interaction, how does the customer look at the vehicles? How do they interact with the salespeople? All of this is telling you something. So it's that just pull yourself back and look at the experience through their eyes.
Okay. So what I got on that is if you compare the if I build it, they will come versus the solving real problems, the parallel to that below that is listen and interact with your customers. Be present where they are. Listen with an open ear and hear them versus data analytics and paralysis analysis, trying to understand consumer behavior as opposed to just giving them a call and talking to them and getting a feel for what they're experiencing. So I got that. What would be the next one below that? If listening and interacting with your customers versus just spending too much time with data is number one, what would be the number two or number three component to ensuring that you're heading in the right direction and building your brand?
I mean, you would still have to look at your data.
Okay.
Data is really important. And for my first example, I just threw it out the window, but it is really important. And again, I'm going to use another example, which is Mrs. Fields cookies. And it started by Mrs. Fields. And she was very young. And her husband was he was in a computer data management systems. That's what he did for his own business. And he built a system behind for each store. And the stores, she followed the concept. She could have easily followed a franchise concept. It's hard to capitalize and support a business when you don't have a lot of money and you have to get the masses, or at least the economies to scale. And they put in the system that she could see every day the transactions in the store and every type of cookie that was being cooked. And every store had their own kitchen, so they actually cooked their own. So they didn't have a centralized product. Each store had the reason she did that as well was she wanted each store to be proud of what they're cooking, what they're making, and that they have skin in the game as well. And so the data becomes really important to understanding what's going on. And through that data, every day she'd be looking and things would be pointed out, and she would call a store or she would walk into the store because she saw issues. So that data becomes really important. And I have the 5 C's of branding. And one of the key C's in branding is consistency. And it's so easy to make your customer happy if you spend a lot of time making sure that they're happy. But how do you do that every day, every time? That becomes the challenge. That's where brands are successful and brands that aren't successful, because they lose that ability to have that consistency. And that consistency comes from data, comes from processes, comes from automation, comes from suppliers. To go bigger, back to your question, is you have to have everything else aligned to that customer. The other person I haven't talked about is your employees. And if they're not on board with your vision, and I know you guys have talked about the why of a business, if they don't understand that, they can't execute what you want every day. So all of these are very complex. And I simplify it down to the 5 C's. And the 5 C's is commitment, construct, community, content, and consistency. And all 5 have to be right. And working consistently, there's that word again, probably the most important of all the C's. If you don't have consistency, you don't have a brand.
So I tried to get those down real quick. Consistency was the first one. Commitment.
Yeah.
And then I missed the one between community and content.
Construct.
Okay.
And construct is the physical aspects of your brand. It's the touch, the feel, it's the logo, it's the name, it's the tonality, it's what it looks like if you've got a store, if it's packaging. All of these things communicate something. And collectively, the content is all of those touch points, all those communication touch points. And when I say content, most people go to advertising, right? It's marketing. And marketing's only just a piece of it. Because we talked about employees. Employees, if you've got a sales force, or you have a touch point, a touch point of sales, your employees become the face to your brand.
Yeah.
And so that has to be consistently executed as well.
Yeah.
But most brands, when they start off with their entrepreneurs, they don't have any money for advertising. So the biggest element there is public relations, being the voice.
Which in a way, back to public relations and being the voice, is being present, right? Especially when you don't have the money, you're being present in the community, you're seeing what's going on. Rich, I was just about to ask a question. I don't know if you were thinking the same thing. I was just about to ask, what's the difference between somebody who started a champagne hundreds of years ago that still exists today, and somebody who started a champagne 200 years ago who doesn't exist today? We don't even know them because their brand went out 10 years later, 20 years later, maybe even 100 years later. They didn't last 200 years. And I think the answer you gave us was the 5 C's. If your team and you and everybody is committed, if you have the right construct, if you build the right community, if you have the right content, and you just keep consistently going at it, that's what makes a difference between a brand lasting 10 years versus 100 versus 200, right?
And it also means not just sitting and doing the same thing over and over. You have to evolve. That champagne that she made 200 years ago is totally different than the champagne that is today.
Sure.
Palates change. It was much sweeter, actually, way back when. And today it's not as sweet. That's where the data becomes really important to understand what's going on every day. Because if you're going to sit there and say, it's perfect, I don't have to do anything differently, then time will pass you by.
Kim, as I look at the reviews that you have on Amazon for the book, I'm noticing a pattern of a lot of the reviews are from women. When I see names Sonia and Louise and Mary Lou and Bonnie and Ginger and Nicole, what's the message that you want men to have that will draw them to this book? Because one of two things is happening. Either more women are reading it and rating it, or just more women are more likely to rate it. I'm not sure which is happening, but either way, there's a message I'm sure you have for men that will draw them to the book. And I'm curious as to what that is.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Thank you. A large percentage of the readers are women. There's an interest to know. And if you read some of because I've read all the reviews, there's the word inspiring that's coming out. Women are inspired to read about other women succeed. From a man's perspective, I think we can stop and go, they succeeded, but how? And what can we learn from how they succeeded? And today, what's really interesting is 10 years ago, you would not have heard a caring brand. What's a caring brand? These women understood that going back. Mary Kay is a good example, or C.J. Walker is another really good example. C.J. Walker was the first Black millionaire in the United States, and she started a company with hair care products. Black women had problems with a number of problems with growing their hair. And again, go back in time, there were outhouses and there was not a lot of times you were washing your hair. So she had tonic and she had a number of different products to help women. And she built her business on supporting other women, people, and to work with her. And she had to train them because they didn't know how to sell something. She actually had a school. She had a school, but she was actually teaching them how to dress, how to present themselves, more than just trying to sell her product. Mary Kay did the same thing. So you look back at these brands that are still today successful. The other one I'll pull out, which is not so successful right now, just went into receivership in the UK, which is The Body Shop. Anita Roddick, who started that company, started it with the whole idea of environmental friendly products, no animal testing. Again, these are revolutionary ideas. Now, today, I don't know why the company's not doing very well, but I think it has gravitated somewhat away from where she was. And maybe trends are changing as well. But what we can learn from these women is how did they think and how did they look at their customers? And we're seeing this. We're seeing the shift today with the millennials out there and Z, on wanting to know, why are you in business? What's the real reason you're doing this? Tom's Shoes, good example. Caring brand.
Kim, thank you for joining us today. I know in the reviews it said you were a great storyteller, and you certainly demonstrated that verbally here. And I'm looking forward to getting more into that in your book, Branding Queens, and getting some of that inspiration that is commented on so much for those that have reviewed the book. Much appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you very much. And I have a second book, believe it or not, that will be coming out this fall. And it's called Loyalnomics, The Power of Branding. And so I hope that will come out this fall. And so if you enjoyed hearing about the 5 C's, this goes into great depths about the 5 C's.
Great. Thank you.
Stay tuned as John and Rich unpack today's conversation.
Rich, I'm really happy when I asked that question about data versus getting in front of your customers, how he clarified, data is still important. But I think what he was trying to articulate is that a lot of entrepreneurs, I've been certainly one of them, stop at the data. They get to know their customers through the data versus really sitting down with them and understanding what is going on and what they're experiencing with their brand. And I don't know why that's the case. Maybe it's the path of least resistance. It's, I got the data here, so I know what people are thinking. Versus what ends up happening is the data is reactive. You're looking at data that happened in the past versus getting in front of it with your customers during their sales process, right? Or during their experiential process with your product or service, and really understanding how they're experiencing it so you can actually make corrections along the way where it's more interactive. So happy you clarified that. It made a lot of sense to me.
And women, as he said, really honing in on solving a problem. So when looking at the data, often what I've experienced and I've seen with entrepreneurs is the problem becomes, how do we get more revenue? Or how do we get more profit? It becomes a problem to solve. Versus the way the women did it that he described is they observed people interacting with their product. So when he said Estee Lauder gave samples, I'm sure that was a result of Estee Lauder hearing people say, I don't want to buy the whole thing. I want to see what it looks like or what it smells like before I go buy it. So she created samples. But you wouldn't get that out of the data. All you would get out of the data is what are the sales and a few more things that may be tracked. Liz Claiborne, who did the mix and match of clothing, went out and watched people do the mix and match of clothing to see if there was a problem she needed to solve and how people were interacting with the product. That wouldn't happen from the data. I'm not saying data is not important, but I would double down on all of this research that Kim did that says there's something women, for whatever reason, intuitively are doing that men generally are not, in not just solving a problem with the original service or product or widget, but then solving a problem of how it's working for the consumer out there in the field by interacting with the consumer.
Yeah, really caring, is this working or not? And do you need this or not? Am I solving a problem versus, creating revenue and profits? The one part that I know is overlooked, and he hit it right on the head, is you cannot build a great brand without being fully aligned with your employees on what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And I think this is a big part that we keep seeing over and over again. You can only get so far on your marketing. You can only get so far in growing a company and adding more people to your business in terms of team members before you start realizing that without alignment and people really genuinely caring about your business that they're working in and caring about the product and the service and the customers and the whole interactivity of everybody, your brand starts going the opposite direction. You start losing that value that you initially thought you would have because you have a great logo, a great service, a great product, but the team is not as engaged in it as you would hope them to be, which comes back to leadership and building a culture within your team that really they understand why you exist and why it's so important for them to listen to the customer, to service the customer, to improve every single day. That piece is such a big piece in building your brand.
Well, looking at those 5 C's, he started with consistency. And then the other 4, I can absolutely see how they reinforce consistency. He says commitment. I'm sure part of commitment is a commitment to consistency. Construct, how things are constructed in the back to do what? To create consistency. Community. What's the community going to be talking about if the brand is inconsistent? And then content. That content has to be consistent. So I totally get why he started with consistency, because what is a brand if the brand cannot be relied on to consistently deliver its promise?